So as we saw earlier, the tropical climates, they're what we see in the purple band, close to our equator, with a no month typically under 18 degrees Celsius. So in the wet tropics, we have heat and rainfall, and it's going to leach most of the nutrients from the soil. So phenomenon in the tropics is very poor soils. So there's so much rainfall in what you might find is a monsoon season or rainfall event that it actually takes some nutrients and pushes them down what they call through flow into subsoils, and they're not available. So except for biomass, so we see our nutrients being tied into the biomass of the trees because we don't have deciduous trees. So typically you would describe the trees here as evergreen. They don't lose their leaves. So the nutrients and the biomass are staying up, not in the soils. So that's 80 or 90% of the available nutrients in a jungle situation are in the trees. So the soils and climatic characteristics will dictate the specific broad design responses. So as a permaculture designer, when I go into a particular region, I have to understand the characteristics of the soils driving the characteristics of the trees. So the trees are a response to particular soil characteristics. In this instance, it's driven by rainfall, increased rainfall, poor soils. So in section 10.1, we'll be looking at special topics of the humid tropics, such as our soils, mulch sources that we can find in the tropics, and we can plan for polycultures. So in the tropics, we're going to use much more polyculture systems than we might find in other climates. And we can also look at houses. What would be an appropriate house design? So if I'm living in the tropics, how would I design my house? So inappropriate strategies are those that bear soil cultivation. So in the tropics, since there's such poor soils, to ever have cleared soils is really bad idea, because when the rains come, it leaches all your nutrients. And that can be seen here around Raktamachat, where the people are all doing monoculture, annual cropping, where they plow the field every year. So they grow corn, they grow cassava, and at that point you have bare soils, the rains come, as they are doing now, and at which time we get leaching of our soils. An appropriate strategy would be to cover the soils. So in this instance, we can see a yard, and we see, again, something like a wild garden, and we're going to cover the soils with plant mass, biomass, year-round. That's a strategy that we may look for. And we can look at different ancient civilizations and how they approached in tropical situations. So how did they have this large number of people where they could grow enough food? This is another aspect that we may want to look at. So the Mayan civilization, for instance. So what did they do? Well, they had complex perennial fodders and food systems. They're known to be stable, but they're not yet part of the officially funded agriculture from sources such as the World Bank. So what is this saying? Well, basically, if you want to do traditional agriculture based on like traditional things, and you go to ask for funding, no one will fund you. If you go to ask to do monoculture or commercial farming, yes, here's money. That's a really weird thing. So it may be in the future nice if we can get our governments to be more supportive of funding of these types of agricultural systems. So some problems can arrive in tropical soils. The soils are old and they're not renewed by glaciations. So when we looked at our climates and we could notice the graph and we saw this trend like every 10,000 years of basically glaciers coming in and retreating through the ice ages. When they did that, they grind the rock and they make basically the glacial rock dust. And that's really high in minerals. So we find in temperate climates that have been covered in the past by glaciers, okay, that have better soil due to the rock dust being ground. But that's never happened in the tropics. We've never had a where, at least in 800,000 years that we can do ice core samples, we've never seen that the tropics were covered in ice. So we never had an issue where the sub thing was ground. So when you go and you look, very poor soil. So some problems will also arrive in the tropical soils. So most of it, the supply in silica, again based on rocks being crushed, is low. So we don't find silica in the soils, very low concentrations. In clays, aluminum ions, and they substitute some silica ions, giving soil particles a net negative charge. So what does this mean? Well, if we're doing our cation ion exchange that we saw was so important to transfer minerals, and here the actual electric conductivity of the soil is poor. So it doesn't transfer minerals very well. And that's something that we can work on. And there's different ways that we can restore the soil's ability to hold nutrients. We can restore humus with green crops. So a technique we would use is called cover cropping. And some people refer to that as green manure. So instead of having a cow, for instance, eat the grass and have the manure, we can actually grow a cover crop, and then we cut the cover crop and feed the cover crop directly to the soil, which is called green manures. Generally, any cultivation will lose humus as carbon dioxide, so try to grow plants in what's called intercropping. So in this instance, if I have, for instance, my main crop, maybe I want to grow moringa tea. So I have a bunch of moringa trees. And between the moringa trees, I may have some type of other intercrop. And that intercrop I could consider as like a green manure. So I may actually put something like sun hemp. Sun hemp has a nice flower, attracts bees, and also, it's not the one that you smoke, it's a different species. And at that point, it's going to fix nitrogen. So I can fix nitrogen, I've covered my soils, and it's going to help me for my main crop, which would be my tea. So an essential soil fraction is creation must be given considerable emphasis towards sustainability. And what does that mean? Big sentence, simplistically, I need to see the soil as an asset. And so if I'm going to measure if Raktamachat increases in value each year, could I also look to the value of my soils increasing in humic material? So if I'm increasing the humic level of my soils are going to be more productive year after year. So this is a way to value and understand and appreciate our soils and why we would work on improving our soils. So a designer's checklist that we can look at if we're going to work in a tropical region. What might I want to look at? Maximize tree crops, herbaceous perennials, things like bananas, pawpaws, arrowroot, or taro. Any of these types of plants are going to be something that you're going to get a really great yield with very little work. So try to put those types of plants in. Complete earth shaping before setting out any plant systems, which look at your water harvesting. We need to slow that overland water flow because that overland water flow is leaching our nutrients. We need to do our earth shaping first. So we come to the site, put in our ponds, our roads, our swales. Then we go in and we plant trees. Once we have those laid out, that gives us edge. I have the edge of the road to put trees. I have the edge of the swales to put trees. I have the edges of the pond to put trees, right? That will create the zones between those, and then I can work in there. So this gives me the outline as we saw in the food forest. Where's my border? Put in your edges, work in your zones. Choose adaptive high-value foods for intensive mulched home gardens. So really understand your market. Don't put in low-value things that you're not really going to be able to deal with. So look at the high-value things that are valued in that market. If you're not able to sell it, you're not able to get any money. You can't pay your bills. So what is a high-value product in your market? Avoid bare soils at all times. Never clear the soil because of the poor soil conditions and the high erosion events in the rain season. And design to carefully plant animal species related to culture, market, processing, and the available labor. If you put in a plant species that you need to have all these people to come work, but they're not available, then you're beholden to labor. Be very careful as a permaculturalist. If you don't have access and you're not going to use a tractor and you can only use labor, then you may always be trying to get people to help you, but they don't want to. So think about that in the future, that how much labor is associated with the particular yield. So look for things with a high yield. People are going to predict what they're going to want in the future. Do you think in the future people will stop wanting avocados? So for sure, if I had the right soil condition here, I think that would be a great thing to grow. But since I don't have that soil condition, right? I don't have sandy soils, I have clay soils. I can look at mangoes because I'm sure that in the next 100 years, people are not going to stop wanting a mango, right? So these are different times. Figure out what works in your local conditions, your soils, and what the market is not going to change and that you're able to harvest. So design houses for low energy climate control. It's like your bungalow. The bungalow has very low thermal mass, the wood. So during the daytime, it could heat up, right? The sun hits the wood. But since it's low thermal mass, once the sun goes down, it cools down very quickly. So it's not hot. It's not going to hold the heat in, not like a concrete house. If the sun's hitting the concrete house during the daytime and I go in at night, it's still hot, right? So this is something that we can think about, climate appropriate housing. So try to emulate the food forest again. Look at that backyard, very tropical. We want to emulate forests themselves in our ecosystem. We establish dominant species of our series of legumes, palms, and useful trees with complex understories, a ground layer, or any useful fodder plants. So something that I can feed to an animal, right? Understory, canopy layers, herbaceous layers, ground covers, and always remember vines can be a great layer also. So in wet, dry tropics, more open palm polycultures exist. So we use palms to create what's called dapple shading. Here we have problems, it's too bright. In the middle of the day, you go outside, it can get to 40 something degrees, 43. The plants are sitting there going, I can't take it. So if I want to do the more, what I call lush or vegetables, or leafy greens, right? I actually have to put up shading. So instead of putting up plastic shading and all this, we can use small trees that don't have a lot of canopy, and palms are very good for that. So you'll see that people in the tropics putting up palms to create dapple shading to protect from sun. So here we can see that some dapple shading trees helping to reduce the amount of sunlight coming in so that the more delicate plants, the ones that we like to eat, have a more controlled environment.